All right, well, hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. Thanks to Adam. Like he said, it's my first time here in Australia. Has been quite an adventure. Been around for 3 days or so. Already seen a lot of stuff. Wanted to see some kangaroos. I've seen a lot of them already. Most of them appear to be sleeping on the side of the road, I noticed. So next goal is to see a live one. Still have like 2 weeks to go, so I have high hopes. No, but seriously, thank you to Adam. I pinged him a few weeks ago, told him I was going to come to Australia just for the heck of it because I like traveling. Never been to Australia before. And so I asked him if I could stay with him for a few days. He said, sure, as long as you speak at the user group. So it's like, okay, here I am. Cheaper than getting a hotel room, right? Now I do get the feeling he didn't want to spend a lot of time with us because it was like the minute we got here, he decided to fall off his motorbike. So I don't know, dubious. But anyway, we got a lot to talk about. Who am I? My name is Markus Egger. I'm the president and chief software architect of a company called EPS Software Corporation, better known under our code brands like Code Magazine, Code Training, Code Consulting, things like that. And what I do personally is what I assume most of you guys do. I'm the founder of the company, but I've kind of come full circle, spend most of my time at this point writing production code. Probably about close to 90% of my time goes into writing production code. A lot of .NET stuff, a lot of HTML stuff, so the stuff that you would expect, right? Now, when I don't write code, I do a lot of presentations like this one here, or all the way up to the bigger conferences, and most of it done in North America, a little bit in Europe. I'm actually originally from Europe. Now, that's why this is kind of a significant trip for me, right? I'm originally from Austria. So I've spent a lifetime with people thinking I'm from Australia, but I've never been here, right? So now finally getting around to that. So that's where I'm from originally. We actually have a business in Europe, but I spent most of my time in America. My company is headquartered in Houston, Texas. Personally, I live in Hawaii, so it's not been that long a trip for me. Relatively easy flight down here and very enjoyable so far. I'm also Microsoft Regional Director, or RD, just like Adam. So you guys are probably familiar with this, but I always like to point out what that means. It means I have a formal relationship with Microsoft, but I am not, very important, I'm not employed by Microsoft in any way, right? I don't get paid from them in any way. So I obviously like Microsoft a lot. That's why I have this relationship. But at the same time, I'm independent. I can do and say whatever I want, and those of you who've seen talks of mine know that I often do. And it's kind of important for the topic we're talking about here today. What else? I'm a Microsoft MVP. Actually, this slide's a little outdated. I guess I'm now supposed to be a Dev Division, Dev Tool MVP, whatever they renamed it to. I have been an MVP since 1995, so I'm always proud of that. There's only one other MVP that's been in the program this long. So that's it about me. What else? My marketing guys always tell me have to have at least one marketing slide. So here it is. We're consulting, business training, and so on. Do the usual stuff, .NET, Google, Apple, Azure, Amazon Web Services, databases, probably what you would expect. So that's it for marketing. I'm going to skip over that. Now let's talk about today's presentation here. We got a ton of stuff to talk about. In fact, more than I can cover, because this talk that I'm doing here today really goes with a series of presentations we have been doing for years, mainly in North America and a little bit in Europe, and that's what we call our State of .NET tour. And what we do in that is we go from city to city every spring, every fall, we do a series, and it's a long afternoon of content. Now, we don't have a long afternoon today, so I'll have to trim it down a little bit, but there's actually more content than I can cover here, and in the show notes for the online people, we'll put some links to get additional samples and information. And I'm just kind of focusing on the most interesting or the things that I know haven't been covered as much as some others. So, what are we going to do in the big picture? Well, we are looking at what is the state of .NET. In other words, what's important to us as .NET developers. That, when we started doing the series of events, literally was .NET only. Nowadays, it's different, right? Nowadays, we're talking about all the things that a .NET developer does, which includes a lot of things that are non-Microsoft, right? Whether that is things like Angular or various clouds and so on. So we're approaching it a little bit with the Microsoft angle, but it certainly is a little bit of a bigger topic than just that. But today we're going to start out, we're going to look at .NET as a platform, what's going on there. Then we're going to look at Visual Studio and IDEs. We're going to talk about web development. We're going to talk very briefly about Windows and cloud. I just don't have that much time to talk about here today. That doesn't mean it's any less important, right? So in the big picture, I kind of still do need to mention that in a way, but we just don't have that much time to talk about that here today. So that's kind of the overview. Little bit to set the stage. Not going to go into a lot of detail here, but just a little bit about Microsoft because it's kind of important for some of the later topics. Now, I'm not super familiar with the Australian market, but I think you probably saw the same thing that we saw in the US and in Europe, where Microsoft kind of did this dive a little bit, right? Like, be very surprised if Windows 8 was super popular around here. But things have truly changed with Microsoft, right? So in a way, I think one of the key topics that we now see kind of worldwide in all the locations I've been is Microsoft is back as a cooler, friendlier, and more open Microsoft. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the important part is the openness, right? And not just being open, but embracing just about anything and everything there is. And that's going to set the tone for a lot of the things we're going to talk about in more detail there. Now, I put up a few logos here. The most important ones, perhaps. It's not meant that there isn't anything beyond that, but this is kind of representative in a way. So Microsoft changed from being this Windows-only company where everything revolved around Windows, right? Like, why does Microsoft have Visual Studio, right? Why have they had Visual Studio for 20 years? It's the 20-year anniversary now of Visual Studio, right? And the reason for most of the history of Visual Studio was that Microsoft wanted us to develop for Windows. If that wasn't the case, right, there would have been no Visual Studio. And with Microsoft moving away from being a Windows-only company, that changes all that and has huge impacts. And then we can ask the question, well, what does that mean exactly? Does that mean Microsoft now says, well, do whatever you want, use your own development environments, and we are okay with that? Or does it mean Microsoft is truly embracing that scenario? And that's exactly what it is, right? The embracing of everything there is out there and helping people, helping developers with those choices that they make. And that's a true game changer, right? If Microsoft goes out and says, well, we now love Linux, what does that mean? Does that just mean it's like, yeah, fine, you can run Linux? Or does it mean we'll help you with Linux, right? And that's, like I said, that's exactly what it is. So we'll see that has a huge impact throughout some of the things that we're talking about. The open Microsoft, right? Microsoft turning to open source. That's very, very interesting. I mean, now a way you can look at it is, unless there's a good reason for Microsoft to not do something open source, the default in DevDiff especially is they are doing open source. So if you are into ASP.NET, the core version of the new ASP.NET, what used to be called vNext, if you followed that whole vNext development cycle, you could follow that on GitHub and you could become part of it all. You could look at the check-ins, you could add your own submissions and post pull requests and see the bug tracking and all that sort of stuff. So very, very open, very interesting developments. Also very interesting because open source software at that scale is, almost, I don't want to say unheard of, but this is pretty serious stuff, right? And some of the pain that comes along with that, like some people were like, well, we saw all this stuff in vNext and now it's all changed and how dare you, right? Well, that's what open source is like, right? You see how it's made. And so again, very, very interesting development. I put up the GitHub logo here simply because that's where Microsoft does all that stuff, right? So if you want to follow along. So anyway, that's kind of the quick overview. Just to set the stage a little bit, right? I could talk about any of these subjects for 2 or 3 hours on its own, but that's where we leave it today. Now at this point, let's dive in and let's look a little bit at .NET as a platform. Okay, that's kind of the underpinnings of what we look at as .NET developers. So let's take a look at what's going on in .NET. And of course, the big thing there, as we've already discovered, is .NET Core. Right? This is a development that's been going on for quite some time. Right? This is not a small effort. This has been going on for years. Is this rewrite of .NET. And the question, of course, has to be, well, why even do that, right? What is this new thing, and why the heck do we need it? And what does it do for me that the old .NET didn't do? And when you first look at .NET Core, you may actually get the impression that, well, this is just like the old one, right? And maybe it's missing some stuff. And why would I go this new route when it's missing some stuff? But the key is to understand why Microsoft did all this. When we look at .NET, which .NET in itself is pretty old too, right? I just mentioned Visual Studio, 20 years old. Well, .NET is not that much younger. The first version, the first beta or alpha version of .NET, I think came out in '99. So, thinking back a little further when this was first conceived, that's 20 years ago, essentially, right? The COM plus objects, as they were called at the time. So that's a long time ago. I was actually part of the Visual Studio team up in Redmond at the time. And there was a lot of very interesting thought went into this, right? Some very, very good things that are really solid to this day, I think. But this fundamental idea of let's build a platform that can execute all the code, and let's get away from having a Visual Basic compiler and UI designer and all that, and a C++ one and a Visual Fox Pro one and who knows what else. Going away from that and just making it a unified platform where you had certain technologies that can be driven from any .NET language. And that was a huge deal. Getting away from DLL hell and putting everything into a global assembly cache. Huge deal at the time, right? And certain things are still very valid today, like the unified language system. Pretty cool, right? But also when we look at the environment that we had back then, there were a lot of decisions that were just based on completely different scenarios. Back then, the server side of things just became big. The fact that you can actually do serious server-side development for web pages. Right? It's not that long ago, 1995 maybe, when we first really got serious about the internet. And then we had ASP, the regular ASP version, right? And then that was kind of a pain to use. And so people had just started to discover the usefulness of dynamic HTML, server-side generated HTML. So, having servers that run this stuff, having an ASP.NET Web Forms runtime environment or framework, right? Those things were incredible. But they also had some downsides, like they were based on a huge platform that we always installed all or nothing, right? They were based entirely on Windows, of course. They were based, like the ASP.NET stuff was based entirely on IIS. And so, these assumptions today are just not as valid anymore, because today, first of all, the platform has grown tremendously. We'd like ways to chop that into pieces, make it more lightweight, especially in cloud-based scenarios, right? General cloud-based scenarios. That's very, very nice, is the ability to split it into smaller packages. So when we then put it on servers and we have to pay for the space and bandwidth and so on we use, it's certainly nice if that's small. Would also be nice if we could side-by-side install stuff, and that didn't really work so well. And then, of course, people like to use platforms other than Windows. So could we fundamentally make .NET work on other platforms? Well, there was a lot of dependencies into the Windows system and on the ASP.NET side into IIS, right? So how do we eliminate all those things? So a lot of the re-envisioning of .NET, which we ultimately came to call .NET Core, has to do with that sort of stuff. And then, of course, you can think that a bit further, and you can say, well, not only do we have Linux and do we have Windows, but now we have these mobile devices, and couldn't we use that there as well, and so on. All of a sudden, the world appears a whole lot bigger, and all the things we can now do, right? So those were some of the things, some of the fundamental thoughts that went into this re-envisioning of the .NET, core .NET runtime and framework, and so on. And so that took a few years. Now we have that available, right? .NET Core, as we heard earlier, is now released, has been for a while. Tools have now been released. We'll look into that more a little bit later. So it's starting to mature a lot, so the framework around it is starting to grow more, because that was a problem for a while, right? And so it's really starting to be something that you can use for real. Now I want to give you a quick demo here, and I'm going to start very simple. Right, show you some of the fundamentals. Now, some of you are going to say, this is the craziest stuff I've ever seen. Why would I ever use this? but just bear with me here because we'll grow that out. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go into PowerShell here. And as Adam already showed us before, we can go in here and we can run the .NET command, and that tells me I have the .NET Core runtime installed. Right? So this is this new system. Where did I get that from? Well, you can just install that by going to this somewhat awkward URL, which is .net. Really a simple URL, it's just awkward to say in a presentation. But you can go there, you can go and download this runtime system, and once you do that, you then have this command line interface, right? So, you know, some of you are going to look at it and say, why would I ever use the command line, right? We got, Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, they're all big about graphical user interfaces, and we moved in that direction. Well, now Steve Jobs is dead and Bill Gates is off saving Africa somewhere. So I guess we can get away with using the CLI again. No, but in all seriousness, there's a lot of scenarios where using a command line interface is really appealing, whether that's automation or just some things are just easier in the command line. So we have that option now, but if you think that's the craziest thing ever, you don't want to do that, not to worry, I'll show you a higher level version of this in a moment here. But so we have the system now installed, so now we can start doing stuff with this just here from the command line. So let me just go into a different folder here. And I'm going to make a Sydney folder. Okay, which of course is completely empty at this point. And now I'm going to issue a command here using this .NET CLI, this .NET command line interface. And I can say .NET new. Now, depending on the exact version you installed on, you have installed on your system, .NET new will just create a new project, basically the simplest version of a project, which will be a console app. Or you can actually reference a specific template name. The version I have installed here, when I just do a .NET new, it tells me, hey, I want to know what the template is, which one do you want to use, and it shows me a few here. So let's actually say .NET new console, which will create a new console app for me. Okay, so this is essentially very similar to doing a new project where you're picking a template in Visual Studio, except we can do this completely without Visual Studio at this point. So what did this create for me? Well, this created two very simple files, a program.cs file and a csproj file for me. So that's kind of the very minimum that we need in terms of our assets for creating a .NET Core application. Okay? Now we could go ahead and we could modify the program.cs file. It says hello world. I'll show you in a moment. But for now, we'll just run with this. So how could we actually go ahead and run this? How could we essentially do an F5 in Visual Studio? How could we do that here? Well, there's this command called .NET run, which will build and execute this, but we are still missing something else. And that is, there's dependencies, right? Dependencies that in the old days might have been in the GAC, the Global Assembly Cache. Now, those dependencies come in as packages. And they can be tiny, right? We can build a very pointed, tiny .NET Core app that only has very specific things in here. And this project, because in the project file it has some defaults like system.whatever, right? And we can do a .NET restore, and that'll perform a package restore from us. So this should go relatively quick here, because this is a small project. Here we go. And now that we have that, now we have the object folder here. Now we can perform a .NET run. That goes and builds the project for us, just like a build in Visual Studio, and it then immediately runs it. And voila, here we go. It says hello world. Amazingly exciting, right? Well, no, it's not amazingly exciting. I totally get that. But what is exciting is when you think of what we have just done, we built a C#-based .NET Core application from the command line, no Visual Studio needed or anything like that. We just installed a small runtime installer package, and we then did a complete compilation and built a project that could run on Windows. So that's kind of cool. Now I'm going to do a very simple AV switch here, high tech. I'm going to plug this in over here and switch over to my Mac. Okay, and so what I have here on my Mac is I did essentially the same thing that I did in Windows. I went to that .NET URL, downloaded the installer package, so there's an install for .NET Core for the Mac. So I installed that here. It's a different install, right, because it's a Mac-based runtime environment, but it's .NET Core for the Mac. So I installed that here, and therefore I can now go in my Mac terminal and issue the same .NET command here, and I have the same command line interface on the Mac that I used to have, or that I have over here on my Windows-based machine. So I already created a Sydney folder. There's nothing in here yet, so we'll do a .NET new, slightly older version. I don't actually pick the console template. It's automatic here. So again, I can take a look at this. So we now have a program.cs and a project.json file. So this is the slightly older version. I just haven't updated. Didn't want to update it before I showed a demo, right? I didn't want to risk that. Let's take a look at program.cs. All right, here is that file. So you see it's just, this will be the same on the PC. We can edit that. Console.readline. Been here for 3 days, so I've learned a little bit of Australian. There we go. Beautiful. All right, done with the editor. Now we do the same .NET restore here. Performs the same exact operation as it would on the PC. In fact, I could have, if I wanted to, I could have just checked the little project I made here on my PC, checked it into, say, GitHub or something like that, pulled it down here on my Mac and continued with that. So it literally is the same thing. And so now I can do a .NET run. All right, goes and compiles it, and sure enough, here's my G'day. Is that about right? G'day world. Not so good, is it? Anyway, so it's perfect. I'm ready to immigrate, I think. Anyway, here it is. So again, very, very simple example, right? About as trivial as it gets, obviously. But when you think of what just happened under the hood, it couldn't be more significant. We are running a .NET app natively on the Mac. Now, it's a super simple app. Don't get me wrong, it's a command line app, and there's users for that. But of course, we want to now spin this example further and do more exciting things with it. But fundamentally, we've now laid the groundwork to do some very, very interesting things. And most importantly, we've broken that Windows wall down, and we can now do this just about anywhere. All right, quick AV switch back here. Back into presentation mode. Okay. So that's at heart what .NET Core is. Now, does it absolutely do everything that the old .NET did? No, it doesn't. Will it ever do everything the old .NET did? No, it will not. Things like WPF, for instance, that are Windows technologies, will not be migrated into this, right? Because why? Right? Would it even make sense to run WPF on a Mac or an Android device? Probably not, right? We want different frameworks. So you won't see that move over. But certainly the things that do make sense, like ASP.NET, for instance, the ability to create services, for instance, those have already been migrated into the system, and we'll only see more and more of that in the future. Okay, so very exciting stuff. Now, to give you a little bit of real-world information, that's why we're doing these State.NET events, because we're kind of at the center of a lot of information that comes our way, because I'm part of so many regional director network, Microsoft MVP network. We publish a magazine, Code magazine, they all have copies in the back there. So we have all the authors, all the readers. So we're at the center point of a lot of things where we hear feedback and we hear about things that work and don't work. And so that's what we want to share at events like this with you. And this is technology that I would say is now really starting to kick in. Right? It's been a while in the making. The very first version of ASP.NET Core, for instance, pretty rough, truth be told. Right? The tooling, like was mentioned earlier, wasn't there. In fact, the project system changed. If you looked very closely, my Mac app was actually slightly different. Used the project.json file, which was kind of the original version of how .NET Core was reimagined, while my PC over here used the newer version, which used the C# project file. Because eventually, after we discovered that everyone wanted to use .NET Core, not just the ASP.NET guys, was discovered that having a build system that already works throwing that out would be kind of a bad idea because so much would have to be rebuilt. So it was a little rough, but now with 1.1 kicking in, it's a lot more ready for production, I would say. And we'll take a look at some stuff a little bit later, like containers and so on. And it's really, really good for that. But for some other stuff, like, should you go out and rewrite your website right now for no other reason than it being on the latest technology? I would not recommend that, right? Hold off a little longer. If I started a new project today, I'd probably consider it. So that's .NET Core, a first look at that. I want to also mention real brief .NET Standard. I'm not going to go into a big sample here. I don't have the time for this here today, but there is a sample of that you can download that will give you the link for this. So what is .NET Standard? Essentially, .NET Standard is a continuation of the portable class library idea. So for those of you who've ever written portable class libraries, that's the idea to say, I'll create a DLL, an assembly, that I can use in whatever, WinForms, ASP.NET, .NET Core, Xamarin for Android, whatever, right? It's just a reusable assembly, typically business logic. So that was a great idea, but frankly, it was a pain to create those portable class libraries. How many of you have created portable class libraries, right? One gentleman in the very back, and probably because he had to, right? No, he loved it. You're the first person ever. Congratulations. Seriousness. It was a great idea, but it was a little bit of a pain because it was hard to make sure you only used things that worked everywhere, and it was a very limited set. And how exactly did you know what that set was? So one of the ideas behind .NET Standard is to say, well, let's first of all standardize what that should be. What is a .NET assembly that should run anywhere? So Microsoft sat down, made that standard, and it's an evolving standard, 1.0, 1.1, we're now at 1.6, and 2.0 is on the horizon. And so once you have that standard defined, then the people building the runtimes and the compilers can make sure they support that standard. So the full .NET framework guys can make sure that standard is supported, same with the core guys, same with the Xamarin guys, and so on and so on. So now we have the standard. Now on the other side of the fence, the Visual Studio guys, the compiler guys, can also make sure they give us a good tooling set for building those types of things. So they give us good standard templates that allow us to create these standard libraries without having to worry about what is supported, what isn't supported. Am I using something that might not work if I build an iOS app, for instance? So .NET Standard makes that a lot more feasible. I find it a lot nicer to build applications or build assemblies using .NET Standard. And it's going to be really interesting, I think, with .NET Standard 2.0. Why is that so much more interesting? Because it just includes a lot more. Right? So with .NET Standard 2.0, I feel once you get to that point, there's really not that much reason for me to build a piece of business logic in a way that would be specific to some platform, right? Or a service implementation. Do I really need to build that in a way that's not compatible with various platforms? I just build it in .NET Standard 2.0. So that's pretty exciting, and I think definitely with version 2, we're going to standardize on that. Right now, try it out. Use the standards. It's just a project template in Visual Studio 2017, but it's still a little bit limited right now. So that's .NET Standard, pretty important. Something I want to mention just a little bit on the side. Very interesting development, but very limited availability at this point, and that's .NET Native. That's what the guys use that build the Windows Universal apps. So very cool technology. What happens there is when you build a Windows Universal app, you build it on your machine, right? You run it in your developer provisioned Windows 10 environment. And then once you're ready to deploy it, you deploy it into the store. And what the store guys do is they take your assembly and they natively compile it through the C++ compiler. And it's actually an amazing technology because they're able to figure out even, if you do reflection or something like that. And then they compile it down to a single executable package. Or I think behind the scenes there's actually more than one depending on different configurations. And then when somebody goes to the store and installs your app, they just get that native package. And the advantage of that native package is much lower memory consumption and much faster startup time because the just-in-time compilation, the JIT step, falls away. So really, really cool technology, but right now relatively limited. All right, how many of you have built universal apps or are doing that? The same poor guy in the back. But that's the typical thing that I see, right? We are building universal apps. We've actually put quite a bit of effort into that. Had some tours with the presentations just around that. But truth be told is it's a niche thing at this point, right? So it fits your needs, great. But I wouldn't tell everybody, abandon your new web development, web app, single page app approach or your WPF approach and just dump it all and start over in universal apps, right? That's not what we are seeing in the marketplace. But if you have a good scenario for it, it's actually a pretty cool platform. It's very likable. Just wish more users used it, right? But so that's what these guys are using, and of course the implied, I don't have any particular inside information on this or anything, but it's kind of implied that this type of technology might come to a lot of other things, which certainly would be very interesting. So that's why I wanted to mention that on the site. So lots of stuff going on in .NET. I guess the most important message I have for you is check out .NET Core. I think the time has come where you want to take it serious. And then also look at things like .NET Standard. Those things are certainly quite important. Now let's leave the platform stuff behind and let's move on to a slightly different, although related topic. Let's move on to the topic of languages that we use as .NET developers. And there is a number of different things that we need to talk about there. First of all, there's the core .NET languages. And we still always get the same question, right? Should I use C# or VB? Or is VB dead? And no, all these languages are alive and well. Which one you want to use depends on the one that you like, right? I often say, which language is better, English or Spanish? Well, it's probably the one that you speak well is a pretty good choice. The one that the people speak that you want to communicate with. And same is true here, right? C# is probably a pretty good choice, but if you're in a team of VB developers and the technologies you want to drive are available in VB, it's not a bad choice. But C#, admittedly, is the leader of the pack, right? That's by far the most popular .NET language, millions of people using it. And certainly a lot of innovation is going on, and it's kind of like in the old IBM days, right? Nobody ever got fired for buying IBM. Well, nobody gets fired for choosing C# as their .NET language of choice. So a lot of stuff going on there. A lot of new things are coming out for C# first, right? So that's kind of the situation, but VB is still going strong. Surprisingly, we actually see a good amount of growth in VB. We see a lot of new people coming in. We see a lot of VB people sticking with VB, at least for their core development. Now, we also see an interesting development where a lot of VB guys, when they try something new, they use C# for some reason. Like there was this big uproar in Windows Mobile, or Windows Phone, I should say. When it first brought out the SDK, it was a C# only SDK, and VB guys were livid. Right? Why is C# coming out first? And then, of course, Microsoft released the VB tooling, and it turns out most of the VB guys still chose to use C#, right? The VB stuff really wasn't adopted very well at all. So it's just kind of this odd phenomenon, and we kind of see this happening time and time again, although these people do not abandon VB otherwise. So it's like kind of weird, right? Do they just want to tip their toes into C# for a while to check it out or something? But so that's kind of what we're seeing there. But again, both languages are going strong. Both languages are strategically important for Microsoft, will be around for a while. Size-wise, C# is about 10 times bigger than VB in terms of users, so an order of magnitude bigger. Now we also have F#. F# goes the other way. It's an order of magnitude smaller than VB. But F# is a really cool language for those who need it, right? If you're doing financial stuff. Or I actually own a company, a spin-off of our organization that does genetic sequence analysis, DNA analysis. And when we do that, we go through gazillions of different steps to analyze DNA. And some of those steps are just very mathematically intensive, and we use F# for some of those, and it's really cool. So if you have a need for F#, that language has some nice features. Now, if you just kind of consider it as like this language that you're going to build your business apps in, like, it's a little bit of a wild ride, I'll tell you what. It's like building, a lot of people tell me they feel it's like writing one huge mathematical formula. I guess not, it's not quite like that, but it's in a way to a lot of new F# developers kind of a fitting description. But be that as it may be, F# has a very important role to play, will be around, even though it's a niche language. So all these languages have a bright future, and whatever you choose, I think you'll be very happy. But like I said, C# is the one that supports the most scenarios. Now that's .NET languages. Of course, as a .NET developer today, you probably need to look a little bit beyond that horizon. So languages like JavaScript are very important. JavaScript in particular is probably the most popular general purpose language at this point. Right? If you have never done JavaScript and you think it's just this nasty, weird scripting language that has all these just oddities, well, it is this nasty, weird scripting language with all these oddities, right? But it also does a lot of stuff that's actually pretty cool. There are some features in JavaScript that even if you're just a C# developer, you should just kind of poke around in it and kind of see what people do with it, because it will make you a better C# developer, because you'll get some new ideas as to how certain things can be handled. And so if you've never done anything with it, check it out. I encourage you to poke around in it. It's not as bad as you think it is. It's actually a pretty cool language in a lot of ways. But it does have certain characteristics. Right? It's a dynamic language for one, which is a great benefit in a lot of scenarios, but it also has downsides in others. Right? There's always pros and cons, and some of the downsides of dynamic languages are when it gets to a point where the project becomes very large and you need to maintain it over time and stuff like that. Then strong typing has really nice benefits. Right? The fact that you can refactor your code base and it's still going to work and things like that. Or with dynamic languages, you tend to have this characteristic that the last 10% of the app just seemingly never get done, because as soon as you change something here, it breaks something there. Right? Those are benefits of strong typing. So whenever you want strong typing, it sure would be nice to be able to bring that in, right? Having that choice. And that's really what TypeScript is all about. So TypeScript, I think I have a separate slide about this. Here we go. TypeScript is this language that's now been around for a while. Was originally created by Anders Heilsberg, the father of C#. Right? That's what he's doing now, is this TypeScript language. And what he's trying to do there, what he has done is, he took the JavaScript language and added interesting features to it. Strong typing is one of them. The ability to create classes, inheritance, generics, all kinds of stuff is what he baked into TypeScript. And what TypeScript does is it's a transpiler, so it doesn't spit out binary code or IL code, but it spits out JavaScript. Right? So it just takes TypeScript and spits out JavaScript. And in fact, TypeScript is a superset of the JavaScript language. So if you never wanted to use any special TypeScript features, you can write plain JavaScript in TypeScript. So that was the basic idea. Now, I'll be the first to admit, when that was originally announced, I was very skeptical, because I would have bet my bottom dollar that the web developer, non-Microsoft community was not going to wait for Microsoft to mess up their JavaScript. Right? But I was completely wrong. It actually turned out a lot of people took to TypeScript, even initially, and did a lot of things with it. So that was kind of cool to see TypeScript gain a lot of traction. And then another thing that I would have bet a lot of money against happened, and that was Google and Microsoft got together. Because Google had been working on their own version of a better JavaScript called AdScript, which they needed for Angular 2 because they needed a mechanism to essentially do annotations on code, or what we would call an attribute in C#. So they created this AdScript language that was competing with TypeScript, and Microsoft and Google got together, and somehow, I would love to have been a fly on that wall, somehow worked it out where Google decided to just never even release AdScript and just standardize on TypeScript as the language for Angular 2. And that, of course, was the ultimate breakthrough for TypeScript. Now it's the default language in Angular 2. Tons of people use it, and it's just at this point, I encourage you to not just check out JavaScript, but also poke around in TypeScript. It's actually a really nice system. Not going to go into a demo here. I'm just going to show you one quick thing just to get you started on that. If you have never done anything with TypeScript, now this is supported in Visual Studio now and other places, but if you have never done anything with it, go to typescriptlang.org, or I think you can even go to typescript.com and it redirects you there. And there's this playground link. And what you can do with this playground link is you can actually type some TypeScript right in here, and it'll spit out the JavaScript that it creates, and you can even run the code right there, right? So here, for instance, is a typical TypeScript function, where it looks very much like JavaScript, except the parameter has a type declaration on it. And that then enforces strong typing. But when you look at what it creates in JavaScript, it's just plain JavaScript, right? But while you're typing it, it helps you with creating this stuff. So this you can try out right here. If you do something wrong, right? It will show you right here in this editor in the web browser. That's just kind of a cool way to play with this. And you can take a look at a few examples to get you started, just to kind of get an idea, and then move on to Visual Studio or one of those tools to really get into it. Highly recommend it. So that's kind of where we're at with the languages at this point. Again, if you're just a .NET developer, that's probably not going to cut it anymore today. Definitely encourage you to check out JavaScript because it's everywhere. It's in the browser. You can do server-side development with Node.js if that's your thing, and so lots of stuff going on there. All right, moving along to the next topic. Let's talk about the development environment, or the development environments, as we should say. Because again, as a Visual Studio developer, yes, we are using Visual Studio to develop stuff, but you'll probably use quite a few other tools as well to get going with your project. But let's start with the obvious one, Visual Studio 2017. Just been released March the 7th, so just a few days ago, been available as a preview version for a while. What is Visual Studio 2017? In essence, it's exactly what you think it is. It's the next version of Visual Studio. It has the typical improvements, new features, performance improvements, really cool. I really like the new performance. Like if you compare startup performance of Visual Studio 2017 with 15, drastic difference. There's new stuff in fast solution loading. So if you, like me, have very large solution files, makes a world of difference. There's also a lot of stuff that goes into the editing experience. Right, so a lot of stuff that, say, in IntelliSense you needed third-party tools for before. Now it's just built in, and then some refactorings. So like I said, a lot of the things that you would expect from a new version of Visual Studio. It also supports a lot of the new types of projects you create. Okay? So that includes, for instance, .NET Core. Okay? So you can build .NET Core applications right out of Visual Studio 2017. In fact, here is my version of Visual Studio 2017. I could just go into my new project dialog here, and you see I've installed all kinds of stuff, including .NET Core, and I could just go and build my console app just like I did from the command line before, built that right here in the development environment. Now, by the way, all these different templates and stuff that I have, they are now considered workloads, right? So there is a ASP.NET workload, there is a WPF workload for Windows development, and so on and so on. And there's a new way to install Visual Studio. Actually, I'm now supposed to call it acquisition. It's a fancy way to say installing. So when you install Visual Studio, you have much more control over what you want to install. So you can say, I want ASP.NET and I want Unity because I'm a game developer, and nothing else. Or you want to say, I'm a Python developer. I still like the Visual Studio IDE. I don't want any of this Visual Studio stuff otherwise, but I want to edit Python files. So that's available too now, right? So there's all kinds of different file types that are now supported that weren't there before. TypeScript, for instance. There were better ways to edit TypeScript before. Now they migrated into Visual Studio. So lots and lots of little improvements like that. The minimum install is now much smaller than it used to be, so you can kind of create a compact install if you just want to do very specific things. So those types of things are there. We'll talk about a few special features. Of course, Azure is very big. Angular is very big. When you do Angular development, what do you usually do? You don't have a solution file, right? Because you're not dealing with the Visual Studio solution. You're opening a folder. Visual Studio now supports opening a folder instead of solution files. So lots and lots of little stuff like that. Visual Studio 2017 is very easy to migrate to, which is nice. So there's really no reason to not move to 2017. There's only some very specialized project templates, like the project.json based .NET Core stuff that was supported in 2015 is now gone because that's just not what .NET Core does anymore. So there's little things like that, but by and large, you can do anything you can do in 2015, even 2013. I have customers that still are in 2013. When I work on their stuff, I open it in 2017. They never know, because it doesn't break the project in any way. So that's kind of cool. There's actually one feature. And again, this is one of those topics, so I'd like to spend just 2 hours just on that, and I actually just wrote a lengthy article that'll be in our next issue of Code magazine. But let me show you a quick example here of something that I really like in 2017. So I just created a simple web application here, actually just a file, new project, create a web API thing, and just picked all the defaults. Right? So I created that. So that has things like this controller here, right? I've not changed the line of code. It's just the default that it creates, right? Default sample. So it has this get method here, for instance, that just returns the string value for the time being. And then what I did is I created unit tests for this. So what I can do in here is I can just right-click, say create unit tests, right? And that created this second project that I have in this file here, which is my unit test project. And it gave me this starting point for a test method here. So I went in here and I instantiate the controller, and I then just use the unit testing framework to say, hey, if I do c.get and pass the number 1, I'm supposed to get back value. Okay, and if so, then we're good to go. So far so good. You probably know all of this, right? It's typical unit testing. But check out this feature. So now we have the ability to go into the test menu, and there's this live unit test item, and I can hit start here. And you see it kind of added a new column to the left of my code editor, and it just takes a moment for this to spin up and actually run. So I'm just in my code editor here, and note that it immediately says, hey, you know, this test here, all of this worked fine, so I have the check marks. I can also see over here that this code is covered by a test. Up here, nope, not so much, right? There's no test in here. So now let's say I do something in here. Let's just say I'm returning id.toString from here. Right? So now you notice that the icon changed. Also notice that in the top up here, we still have the asterisk. I haven't even saved this file yet. But immediately the unit test runs and it says, hey, this is not working anymore. So I could say, oh yeah, that's true. This is really supposed to be 1. Right? And notice that I changed this and it just reruns the test, and right in the editor here it says, yep, now it works again. I never saved my code even. Right? Totally live, really cool feature. Now of course this takes resources, and if you have a large project, maybe you may or may not want that. You can pause it, start it again, stop it and so on. So you have control over when it runs. But yeah, it's a really cool feature. Now, of course, you want to make sure you have real unit tests, not integration tests, right? If your unit test hits the database in a very slow way permanently and it keeps running this thing on every keystroke, probably not a great idea, right? But for real unit tests, I think this feature is actually a very, very cool feature to have. So this is just one example out of many that I picked as one that I think is pretty sexy in that sense. So anyway, long story short, Visual Studio 2017 is well worth getting. Not much of a reason to not get it. By the way, if you want a free version of Visual Studio, I'm always surprised how many people don't know that. There's Visual Studio Community Edition now. Now, a lot of people think, that's kind of like Visual Studio Express used to be. That was like, you could get it, but you could do almost nothing with it. No, this is essentially Visual Studio Pro. Right? So you can get that for free. You can use it for commercial users. You just can't use it as an enterprise customer. And you'd have to look into the exact details of what an enterprise customer is. I actually have a slide about that in here. But so that's something that people should be aware of. And this is not something that's like, oh, I can use it for 2 years and then I have to start paying. No, it's just a free version of Visual Studio Pro, supports things like extensions, which was the big sticking point with Visual Studio Express in the past. So a very cool thing, and you know, great for students, great for hobbyists, but great for professional developers because you can use it commercially as well. So that's cool. Now let's go beyond Visual Studio. Visual Studio is great, right? It's the behemoth that has a million features which you can now install in targeted ways, has designers, visual form designers, database designers, workflow designers, anything and everything you can imagine. But then there are scenarios that don't call for that. There are scenarios that call for fundamentally hacking code, right? So whether that is building web apps where you write JavaScript and HTML or whatever else, right? This ability to just write code really well and have a tool that just pops up and is ready to go whenever you want to do something. And for that, Microsoft has introduced this new tool called Visual Studio Code. Okay, it's a free version of Visual Studio, so to speak, but it's not exactly like Visual Studio. It's not meant to be like Visual Studio. It's just meant to be a really good code editor. Right, so let's just fire this up here real quick. So here we go. Here's my Visual Studio Code. I think I haven't launched it today yet, so it might actually tell me there's an update, but if so, we'll just ignore it. But anyway, so here it is, and now it opened a folder for me right there. This actually happens to be an Angular 2 sample app, and it just opened that for me, and I can now poke around in here and see all the different file types. You see we have syntax highlighting, we have IntelliSense and all that sort of stuff that you would expect, and it's just a really, really good tool to edit code. So this has become super popular, especially in the web development crowd, but not just that. Okay? But certainly if you're an Angular developer, for instance, this is a great tool to use. Visual Studio Code is cross-platform. So when I made my Mac sample earlier, and I just, without saying much about it, I just went into openprogram.cs. It launched Visual Studio Code. I used Visual Studio Code to edit my C# file and closed it back down. Right? Very simple, very straightforward, opens very quickly, and like I said, works cross-platform. So that's a cool thing, because what that means is you now have an editor with which you could, if you wanted to, edit .NET Core stuff on the Mac. That's pretty cool stuff right there. But it's not just for Microsoft stuff either. Like I said, it works really well for HTML type of projects. So an Angular type of application with TypeScript, awesome. It works really, really well. Now I had another file here that I just added to my project here. It's called readme.md. So that's a markdown file, right? And in fact, if we were to look at the status bar down here, note that it says markdown right here at the bottom. So it recognized that this was a markdown file. Now by default, markdown is not something that Visual Studio Code just supports, but if you create a .md file, it'll pop up a little thing and say, hey, there's an extension you could install to edit markdown files. And it just installs that real quick, and now you're editing markdown with full syntax coloring and whatever the file type is, if it makes sense, there's going to be IntelliSense and stuff like that. So there is gazillions of these extensions to edit different file types. So if you're a Python guy, edit your Python files in here. If you like to do React stuff, and you have that odd HTML with JavaScript format, right? There is an editor extension for that. So there's tons and tons of stuff like that, which makes this really, really good to edit anything that's text-based source files. Okay? And in fact, to give you an idea as to how much this focuses just on editing text, check this out. If I go into settings, there's no settings dialog. It's just all text, right? That's how I edit my settings. So let's say I want to change my font to be a little bigger. I just go in here, save it away, boom, there's my changed setting, right? It's everything is text files. Okay? So that's never going to change. That's the idea. Of course, somebody might write extensions that are more, I don't know, do whatever else, right? Database designer, who knows what people will come up with. But fundamentally, the idea here is to just be a really, really good code editor. And that's what it turned out to be. People love this tool. This was released maybe 10 months ago for real as a final release version. I think within the first 3 or 4 months, they had like 1 million daily users using this. Not just total downloads, 1 million daily users of this tool. So people really took to this, and it's a very nice tool to add to your tool belt. And like I said, it works cross-platform, which is really nice. So that's Visual Studio Code. And no particular reason you wouldn't install this. This, by the way, is essentially an HTML app. Kind of a little bit interesting background information. I used to always joke, like, 10 years ago when we did the first fancier web apps, we're like, oh, you can do a lot with web apps now. Probably not a text editor, but you could do a lot, right? Well, that's now out the window. Now we have a full IDE, so to speak, written in HTML. It's an Atom system, essentially, and that's why it works cross-platform. So pretty cool stuff. So that's Visual Studio Code. Another thing that I want to go in here, again, not do a demo, but just mention at the very least, and that is Xamarin. Okay, do we have any Xamarin developers here in the live audience? I knew I could count on you. Perfect. So what is Xamarin? So Xamarin is this third party, or was this third party, that made tools so you could run .NET and other platforms. Originally, they did Linux. They did a Silverlight version that would run on Linux, stuff like that. But what made them big is they made tools to build .NET applications for Android and iOS. Right? That was the big thing. And that's how Xamarin attained critical mass. There's a lot of people using this stuff. And ultimately, Microsoft bought them out. So now, maybe close to a year ago or so, Microsoft bought Xamarin, maybe not quite a year. And now Xamarin is just part of Visual Studio. So you can install the Xamarin workload, right? Gives you the Xamarin features in Visual Studio. And that is why when I go into Visual Studio and into my new project dialog, notice a little small, but small point here. But we now have an Android tab and we have an iOS tab. And that's what allows me to build apps in .NET. This is not Cordova or some HTML hybrid. This is writing native .NET code and compiling it into those two environments. So it compiles exactly the same way that Java would compile for Android. It compiles exactly the same way that Objective-C or Swift would compile for iOS. In fact, you're using, under the hood, you're using the frameworks that those guys use. So you can build an iOS app using C#, but you're driving the Cocoa Touch framework with it. Right? But you're using skills you already have, you're reusing code potentially, especially if you're doing .NET Standard. And this is not just for like iPhone, right? But you could build an Apple Watch app with this. You could build an Apple TV app. In fact, you can do things with Xamarin that most people never realize, like build an app for the Mac, or build an app that targets Windows Universal. So a lot of people these days actually seem to think that rather than building a UWP app using XAML, why not build a Xamarin app for iOS, Android, and UWP? Because you can build apps that target all these different platforms, right? So when you build a Xamarin app, you can either say, I just want to do an iOS app, and I'm using the iOS objects, or I'm building a cross-platform app, and Xamarin has this abstraction layer called Xamarin Forms, and you put a text box on the screen using XAML, essentially. But then when they compile it, they say, oh, you're compiling for iOS. Let me take the iOS object that represents a text box, and let me take the Android object. And thus, you can make about 90% of what you need to do, and then the other 10% you just target build for those 2 or more platforms. And so with that, you can also target UWP, and now you have something that's easy enough to do to make it worth doing UWP. So that's a cool scenario. Like I said, this has long gained critical mass. Very, very interesting stuff. I know my friend Adam and the SSW guys are doing Xamarin hack days around the world, I think. So check that out. It's pretty cool. There's one on Saturday here, I believe, right? But is it sold out, I heard, or is it still? I think it's, well, you may have to check that, but there's more coming up, I know that for sure. So again, we don't have enough time today to really dive into that, but very cool stuff. Now, one thing I want to mention here is you can build both Android and iOS apps on your PC. but to build an iOS app, you need to have at least one Mac in your network as a build agent. That's just Apple enforcing their license, essentially. But all of us here in this room could use my Mac here as our build agent in the network, and then we could just build on Windows, including running the app. There's now a simulator that works in Windows. So that's pretty cool stuff. So that's Xamarin. Now, out of that grew something else, and that is Xamarin Studio. Xamarin Studio is a development environment for the Mac. Used to be available also for Windows, but now all that's rolled into Visual Studio. But there's the Xamarin Studio IDE for the Mac, and that's a full-blown IDE, not just a code editor, but a full-blown IDE that allows you to build Xamarin apps on the Mac, both for iOS as well as Android and whatever else they support. Okay, so that's pretty cool. Visual design and all that sort of stuff that you would expect running on the Mac. Has been available for a while, is still available to this day. But what's the news there, and what's really kind of exciting is that Xamarin Studio is actually turning into Visual Studio for the Mac. So that's a new brand that Microsoft is launching. You can now get a pre-release version for that. And that, of course, does everything that Xamarin Studio used to do, because that's essentially what it is. But they are now putting a huge amount of effort into this and turning it into more of a real Visual Studio. Now, it's not meant to be a direct copy of Visual Studio 2017 running on the Mac, but it's meant to be an IDE that appears Mac-ish, for lack of a better term, to a Mac person, right? It's not meant to drag the Windows paradigm to the Mac, but it's meant to be a native development experience on the Mac that supports .NET development, okay? So you can do Xamarin stuff, but you can now also build .NET Core apps right on the Mac with a full-blown experience. And this will just grow further. Now, it won't be, let's build a WPF app and run it on the Mac, or a WinForms app, because those are just technologies that need Windows to operate, right? But the typical types of things you do, like build web apps, build services, you can now do that entirely on a Mac using Visual Studio for the Mac, which is kind of cool. So that kind of gives us an interesting overview of what the whole development environment, the whole IDE story is all about, right? We have our full-blown Visual Studio 2017, better than ever. We have Visual Studio Code for low-level and very fast code editing. And we have Visual Studio on the Mac as a full IDE to build .NET apps on the Mac. So very, very cool story now. And this goes back to what I said at the very beginning of this talk, where I said, you know, do you just allow all these other environments, or do you truly embrace all these things? And that's an example of how Microsoft embraces things, because you can now be a developer using Microsoft tools without ever touching Windows. And then you maybe take all that stuff and deploy it to Amazon Web Services, right? That's fine if you want to do that. So there you have it. That's development environments from Microsoft, the 2017 generation, I suppose. Let's talk about web development. Clearly an important topic, but it's interesting to reevaluate what topics are really interesting for web development. And what does it mean today to be a web developer, and what are the characteristics of that? Okay? Because we, of course, still have ASP.NET for server-side web development, mostly in the sense when we say ASP.NET, we, of course, mostly talk about generating HTML on the server. Although, of course, also services and stuff like that. But then we have a lot of HTML5-based development on the client, and there's several frameworks that are very viable. This is a large audience we're talking about here. What I see as one of the clear winners that most people use, that we talk to, and that most people are excited about, is Angular 2. Right, so that seems to be something that's coming out as the clear winner in that. But we also see that there are strong secondary contenders. React is one, for instance, that a lot of people seem to use, certainly also has critical mass, and there's several others. Then, of course, there's Node.js for server-side development. So when you look at that, then it's like, well, how much HTML are we going to create server-side exactly? That's dynamic HTML. Right, if I have an Angular app, that's, say, my CRM app that I built for myself. That runs in HTML. CSS, JavaScript. It calls services for the data, but it's probably not going to do a lot of dynamic HTML generation on the server. Okay, so in that sense, ASP.NET MVC, for instance, is certainly not as important anymore. We just don't do as much server-side development anymore. Right? How important is it to have, I don't know, server-side controls? Well, less than it used to be. But it's not completely gone away, because there's certainly scenarios where you want to do exactly that. Amazon.com is probably not going to be rewritten as a single-page app. You know, you go there and the loading indicator spins for the first minute. Oh, now a whole store is loaded, right? I don't see that so much. Or take our business with the magazine. Now, we have articles online, of course, and you go to a URL and it shows that article. I'm not going to do that as a single-page app that spins up all this stuff and can't be indexed really well and things like that. So there's certainly scenarios where we still do the old jump from URL to URL type of scenario. But at the end of the day, that scenario has a little bit diminished. And really what we're talking about here is that a lot of these SPA apps, these single-page apps, they have taken on the characteristics of a rich client application. Right? What we used to do with view models and SAML code or whatever you used in your Windows app, we're now doing with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript or TypeScript on the client. But the kinds of things we're doing are very similar. Okay? So that's how that has changed. So that, of course, totally changes the importance of ASP.NET. But nevertheless, like I said, there's still lots of scenarios where we want to do server-side HTML generation. We already talked about why .NET Core had to be rewritten, had to be reimagined. Well, that originated a lot with ASP.NET, because those were the guys who felt the pain first. The ability to deploy ASP.NET apps to a server, and how big was that footprint, and was there versioning problems, and why can't we do it on anything other than IIS and so on. And to get beyond that, they had to completely start over, because there was a huge dependency on IIS with system.web and all of that. So now we have that version out. It does a lot of stuff. It's starting to get a lot more stable. Still missing a bunch of features that are coming more and more, but it's certainly come a long way. And the way I would the character I would give this is, like I said, if you're building a new app and you understand what this does and you know what you need, evaluate that a little bit first. But if it fits your needs, now that's a really nice and stable platform. But honestly, we are not going, like our own site, our Code Magazine site, it's written in regular ASP.NET MVC, full framework version, not the new stuff. I have no need to actually go out and change that. So, weigh your needs. On the other hand, for instance, the stuff we're doing with our genetics business, well, a lot of that runs on Linux, so it's nice to have .NET Core, and we had special reasons to go that route. But we ran into limitations, like the encryption namespace wasn't available. Well, now what do? Write a service using the old framework that does encryption for you, right? It's just kind of not entirely there yet, but we're certainly getting a lot closer, and a lot of stuff has been moved out. I'm not going to go into a sample here. From what I understand, you guys already had ASP.NET Core presentations here. I want to talk a little bit about the version numbers. That always gets people confused. ASP.NET Core used to be called vNext or V5. It caused a lot of people to think they're using MVC 5, therefore they're using the new version. No, MVC 5 goes with the full framework. MVC 6 is the version that goes with what we now call .NET Core. And when you access data, you're probably going to use Entity Framework 7, right, just to make things a little more confusing. So we still kind of keep the old tradition of Microsoft odd naming conventions, right? So that's kind of how that works there. And I'm going to skip over this relatively quickly. I'm going to give you in the show notes further links for a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to skip over this relatively quick. HTML, we already talked a lot about that. A few of the frameworks that seem to be out there, like I said, if it's not number one, it's still a very big space. So we have customers that use the Facebook React framework, are very happy with it, find a lot of people. There's others like Amber and so on. But Angular 2 we see as the clear winner. And I have downloads for some sample apps for them. I'm not going to go into that here today. There's also an Angular hack day here the next 2 days from what I understand, although I believe that really is sold out. But that happens, I think, twice a year. So keep your eyes out for that. Highly encourage you to take a look at that. I'm going to skip over this sample here. So long story short, there's a lot of interesting stuff going on with web development these days. ASP.NET still is very important for certain scenarios. It's also very important because, of course, you use it for services. The sample I already used with my debugger, that was a services sample, right? Using Web API to build REST services. Okay? That, to me, is the #1 reason I fire up ASP.NET these days. And .NET Core is really nice for building services like that. And we'll take a look at a very specific scenario for that here in a moment. So that is probably what we use .NET Core for more than anything else. And that we've been using it for a while and been very happy with. And beyond that, again, JavaScript, don't forget that. We all need to know it these days. Now let's move on to a different topic here. Let's talk about containers. Containers are a super interesting scenario. This is actually probably one of the things that I'm more excited about these days than any new technology that's come around in a while. So what is this container stuff all about? Containers are essentially a continuation of the virtualization idea. So when you think back of how all the server-side stuff evolved from the early days of .NET, right? We had individual servers growing into server racks. We had now a data center. And then at some point, we started to virtualize things, installing full virtual machines on that hardware, which made it a lot easier to spin up new machines, to scale out. The same image could be used on multiple machines to start up essentially duplicated machines and so on and so forth. And that was a great idea. But it was also a little heavy-handed, right? Because a whole OS is a big image to virtualize. So how many virtual machines can you run on one server and still expect them to perform pretty well? But it was a great idea fundamentally, and it's still useful for a lot of things. But when you think that idea further, it's like, how could we virtualize stuff that is smaller, still takes advantage of that same virtualization, it's independent of the other stuff that runs on the same machine, but at the same time it's smaller and only has the stuff it really needs and doesn't include the operating system necessarily. And that's what a container is, right? So it's app virtualization or process virtualization, if you want to think of it like that. So that's the fundamental container idea. And the most important container technology is Docker. Docker has become the de facto standard for containers. This came from the Linux world, right? Docker for the longest time only existed on Linux, and that's how a lot of Linux guys deployed their server-side applications. Well, now Docker is also available on Windows. So that's kind of cool. So you can actually install Docker on your Windows machine and create small containers. And what's nice is you can create containers that are Windows-based, or you can create containers that are Linux-based. So even though I'm running it on Windows, I could have a Linux container right here. And I could then build my app for that. And now I have this container, and I can then deploy this container to wherever I want it to. And I can be assured that that container works exactly the same wherever I deploy it to, because it's a self-contained unit that's virtualized. So no more of that, well, it worked on my machine type of developer speak, right? If the container works, the container works. So now you can deploy that. There's tools around the orchestration of the logistics of that. So you can create failover scenarios, you can create scalability scenarios, and really, really nice stuff. Okay? So that's now available to us. All you got to do is you go to Docker and download it, install it on Windows. Now you get a command line interface, right? Like everything needs these days. So you can start using the command line interface to compose new images. What's kind of cool about Docker is they have this idea of basing new images on existing images. So you can say, I want to do Node.js development, therefore I want some image that's available in the Docker registry that has what I need for Node.js. But then I also wrote this thing that I now want to run, and I have this one other dependency. So let's compose a new container, a new image that's based on the original one, and then just adds these two small things, and boom, here is a new virtual machine almost, right? A new container image that I can then deploy. So that's how Docker works, and you can do that in the command line, and there's compose files that determine how that works. Now what's really cool is that in Visual Studio 2017 we have support for that right built in. Okay? So let me show you something here. So if I go into Visual Studio and I say let's create a new project, I can say I want to build a .NET Core app that's an ASP.NET web app. And then I'm hitting OK, and yeah, that's fine. And now I can say I want to choose a web API app, and I know it's a little small, but it says down here, enable Docker support, right? And it's actually checked by default. And this adds everything right in that I need to create a Docker image out of this application. Now this requires Docker for Windows to be installed on your machine. If you don't have it, you click that link, you download it and install it. It's just free open source piece of software, right? So I can then go and click OK, it creates my new project. I actually went ahead and did that ahead of time, so let me open that. Now depending on how big your containers are and how fast your internet connection is, the first time you compose a container can take a while, which is why I did this ahead of time, right? So what do we have here? Well, this is my Visual Studio solution here. Now let me make sure that Docker is actually up and running. Yep, it is. Right, so this again I haven't changed a single character in here. This is just the default template for a web API project. So I have my container, my controller here. Right, now what's important is this added things like the Docker file automatically. So this defines how these container images are composed. So this says, start out with this image for ASP.NET Core 1.1. This has everything we need to run ASP.NET Core 1.1. Fairly sizable image. I suppose I could have gotten one that's more pointed, but that has everything I need, and it then basically says use that, add the output of my application, and expose it over an HTTP connection on port 80. So let's just go ahead and let's run this. So I'm going to click the Start button up here, hit F5 essentially. Now note that this actually says Docker, so this has Docker debug support right built in. So let's go ahead and run that. Now what we'll see here in a moment, in a way will not be very exciting. But how unexciting it is actually the exciting part. So let's see what happens here. So this goes and builds. This does a full Docker compose, builds a Docker image. Docker images can now essentially be seen as the new default deployment unit. Right? So rather than creating some sort of exe or an MSI install or whatever you did, now you can just think of this as a Docker, the Docker image as a deployment unit. And here we go, right? So now I browse to this, and you know, here is where it retrieves the value. I can even go and put a breakpoint in here if I want it. Let's refresh that. Okay, and here it hits my breakpoint. And you're like, yeah, what's the big deal? You're running a very simple controller, and you're putting a breakpoint into it, right? We've done that for years. Well, what is the big deal about this here is that this created a Docker image. This Docker image is a Linux-based image. So now my .NET Core app is deployed into a Linux-based Docker image, which Docker for Windows then runs on my machine. So now I'm running a Linux subsystem that serves up a website or a service in this case, that I can browse to from my Windows computer here, and it even takes care of wiring up the debug experience for me, so I never really know the difference. But we are now running Linux right on this machine. And why Linux, by the way? It just turns out that process virtualization in Linux is really efficient. So doing services as Docker containers that use a Linux build is just a really compelling scenario. Now you could have targeted a Windows build as well, but it's just most people use Linux because it ends up in the cloud, usually cheaper because it's more efficient and so on. So really, really cool stuff here. And to me, it's just amazing how easy it is. Like if you've done this before and you had to manually create these images and then set up the debugging for it and so on, was kind of a pain. So one of my favorite features in Visual Studio, and it's just so easy. Again, encourage you highly to check that out. And also once you start playing with this, look into what you can do with this. Like one of the things that we have done for a long time is the way we build our services, we use Web API, but we usually just build an object that has all the methods that we want to call, and we don't care whether those are hosted in WCF or Web API or whatever. They're just an object with methods, and then we have some config files that say, oh, expose it as REST and JSON, and a few attributes that tell us what's the URL and so on. So we then have a standard build of an ASP.NET Web API app, or a template, right? So say create a new project. Now we hope that all the references are the right ones. And then we add in our DLLs, in the future, .NET standard based. We create a config file, never write a line of code, never add a controller, compile it, deploy it. Well, now with Docker, we can say, you know what, let's create an image for that. That Docker image has that app that we need, that pre-built ASP.NET Web API app based on .NET Core. It itself is based on the ASP.NET image, although we probably want a more tailored one that has really only the pieces that we need, not the whole shebang. So it's a smaller container. So then we have that new container, and then we can say, all right, and now add my assembly, my DLL file, and add my config file. And now I have a deployable container. I never need to build a new web API app. But now I can deploy that to Azure. I can deploy that into my own network, Amazon Web Services, whatever. And it makes for a really, really compelling scenario. Easy to scale, easy to do failover scenarios, and so on. So there's a lot of cool stuff there. And I couldn't be more excited about that stuff. So really cool for microservice architectures and so on. And that concludes the containers. In a way, a lot of people are like, what's the big deal, right? It just looks, especially when it works well, it's like almost like it isn't there. But when you really think of the implications, really, really important stuff. Now, I don't have a lot of time anymore, but I do want to talk about a few other things here, just to have mentioned them as well. Let's talk about Windows development. Windows 10, pretty cool. Right? Much better than Windows 8, I think we'd all agree. Creators Update looks very cool. If you're on the Insider Ring and you're getting these things already, there's some really cool stuff there. People love it. You know. How do most people develop for this? Web apps, WPF apps, we see a lot of that. Some UWP, although like I said, not that much, although maybe with Xamarin we'll see a little more of that. Of course, when you do something like HoloLens, I don't know if the SSW guys, do you have a HoloLens here? Have you shown it to people? Maybe in the user group? Perfect, very nice. So that's very cool. So I'm not going to talk a whole lot about this stuff, but certainly wanted to mention it, especially because with the Xamarin stuff, and so it plays into it, and didn't want to make it appear like that was not important. Was there a question? No? Okay. Another thing that in the long version of this talk I'm spending almost 2 hours on, I don't have that time here, but again, I didn't want to not mention this at all. Azure, of course, is super important. I hear Australia is one of the most active regions for Azure. I don't even have a truly updated slide for this, but a little while ago, I think there was 30 Azure regions, and this is growing super rapidly and one of the most successful initiatives for Microsoft, I would say. And you know, the reason I'm bringing this up, even though I'm not talking a lot about Azure here today, is just to kind of drive home the point how well this is working out for Microsoft. And that, of course, is why we are seeing a lot of this stuff. Why is Docker important? Because of cloud deployment, Azure being one of the platforms. But that doesn't mean you can't go to other platforms, right? You want to deploy to AWS, fine, right? Nothing keeps you from doing so. So I just wanted to mention that stuff here just so people don't walk out of here and say, well, he didn't mention Azure in the state of .NET, must not be important. Right? No, it is probably the most important thing that Microsoft has going. I chose to not spend a lot of time on this today because everybody talks about it anyway. The one thing that people often don't notice or don't know about Azure is if you have an MSDN subscription, you have Azure credit, right? Don't throw that away. You can use that credit to pay part of your Azure bill if you want. So activate that, make sure you take advantage of that. And that pretty much brings me to the end of the presentation. I only have like one announcement here, and that is if you're here on site, if you're interested, there's eval forms in the back. If you just put your name and address on this, we'll sign you up for a free Code Magazine subscription and send it all the way from the US to Australia, which is downhill, right? It can't be that expensive, I figure, so. Yeah. So we have that, right? The magazine that comes out 6 times a year, plus a ton of online content and digital content and so on and so forth. And yeah, with that, I'm wrapping up my talk. If you have any questions, I want to turn it over to the audience now. Also, consider us a resource. I always tell people that, right? We are not the company that's going to send you a bill for an email answer. So if you have any questions, fire them our way. Check out the links that we're going to put into the show notes for more downloads. And you can contact me directly. I'm not the expert on every single thing that I talked about today, but we do have people. Adam has people, right? So I'll burden him if I have to. And yeah, we're here to support the community. It's kind of our thing. So thank you very much for coming. I hope this was useful to you guys. And if you have any questions, now let's turn it over to the audience. Thank you very much. Microphone. Ow.
Thank you. SQL Server Enterprise Manager on Mac.
No. I don't think so. Is there? I'm not a big data guy, but no.
No problem.
Now, I don't know, aren't they going to add some to Visual Studio for the Mac to have the connects and structure changes, stuff like that, but not like a whole enterprise management, SQL Studio experience, I don't think.
A lot of our Angular guys are all ex-Java, so getting them anywhere near a Windows machine is tough.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not, I can follow up offline. I can certainly get you the answer, but that's about all I know about it off the top of my head.
Thank you.
That's it. Oh, hold on.
You mentioned Angular 2.
Yes.
You didn't mention Vue.js at all. What's your feelings on that?
Yeah, so I haven't personally done anything with it, but we have a guy in our company who you may have heard of, Rick Strahl, who is driving all of that for us, and he is kind of starting to be all gung-ho about that.
It's the best thing I've used in
so
ages.
I usually value his opinion quite a bit, and so it must not be all bad. Right?
Yeah, and I think it got the most GitHub stars out of all the frameworks in 2016. I don't know if that's a good indicator or not, but it's definitely got a lot of traction. So I was surprised you didn't mention it.
No, that's true. Yeah, I probably should have.
Okay.
Once, I always do once a week we get together and just play with new stuff, and he has been pestering me for about 3 months. No, not that long, but since probably early February to look into that. And so he'll shove it down my throat relatively soon, and I'm sure then it'll be added to this presentation because it does seem to be very promising from what I hear from him. But I haven't even looked at it myself yet.
All right.
And it's with the JavaScript stuff, I mean, there is just, the development is so fast and so many interesting things coming down the pipe. Yeah. So don't take any of what I said today as this, this is it, and don't look at anything else, right? That's just kind of an open-ended thing for sure. The man who is doing all the odd stuff has the microphone.
What do you think about Visual Studio 2017 experimental? Should we use it? Should we avoid it?
I don't have any experience with it. Adam?
I say use it.
Adam says use it.
And part of that answer was based on we've had such good experience with Visual Studio Code and the daily updates. We've had the whole Brisbane office uses it, and they have never had an issue with it.
Yeah, I agree. So you like the updates all the time in Visual Studio Code, just not Windows.
Yeah, that's right.
With the .NET Core authentication part, is that how well developed is that? Are you producing Web API with authentication, and it's gotten quite confusing with the Owen and Katana and all that stuff. It's putting an end-to-end authentication Web API based service out there that you can pop something like an Angular 2 or Vue.
Yeah, and to be perfectly
thing on
honest
top.
with the authentication stuff, I think there's probably better people to answer that question, because we kind of got real frustrated with all the different authentication stuff.
That's
and
where
just
I'm at.
rolled our own a while ago, and that's what we were using everywhere. And
So I felt like I've just gone back to 4.6.2 sort of, and just forgotten that core stuff, and I just feel like I'm just going to leave that for a couple of months to the next version to come out to make to allow some tutorials at least to be complete.
Truth be told, so what we are doing now a lot is, rather than using that authentication framework, we have, like I said, very, very little code that generates any HTML type of stuff in our app. So in fact, we've gone to a point where we have mostly just service-driven stuff. And so we have services that we use for login that basically inject all the information on the response on the JSON workload, right, in the HTTP header. So we authenticate through that and just have our own stuff for that. And so that's why I don't have a lot of experience with.
So maybe separate out the authentication from the rest of the app. Is that what you mean?
Well, it just becomes part of one of our microservices. So we usually have like a user management microservice, and it can log you in by adding appropriate stuff to the HTTP headers, essentially.
Right.
So that's worked pretty well for us. It's a little, not the most intuitive thing, I guess, when a new developer comes on the project, but it allows us to have only web API backends and on single-page apps.
That's certainly what I've been looking for in tutorials. Maybe a good magazine article sometime.
Yeah, not a bad idea.
Okay.
Any other questions? So I have one question while these guys film their evals. Because tonight is free. The price of the pizza is an eval form. And good comments are always appreciated. You've been running a magazine for ages.
We have our 100th issue coming up as the next one.
Right. That must be a bloody lot of hard work. And I have to get a newsletter once a month, and that's enough drama for me. And I used to buy magazines all the time, a long time ago, and then I stopped doing it. Are your competition dropping off? Are your subscribers dropping off? What's happening?
So it's actually, the magazine business these days is interesting in the Chinese proverb sort of way. So certainly print publications are not growing. It was kind of funny when we started the magazine 20 years ago, kind of like Visual Studio, or close to 20 years. There's all these other people around, and they made fun of us because we were just a small company wanting to be a publisher, and haha, isn't that cute? And none of them are around anymore, right? So the only magazines really that are around in our space are like MSDN, that's Microsoft owned. And so yeah, a lot of competitors are going away, and a lot of competitors go online only. And of course, for us, probably the most common way people read Code Magazine is digitally, right? Whether it's Kindle, whether it is online. We just have we're working on a brand new version of a mobile app. And so that's where most people read the magazine. But I enjoy having the print publication. We will not stop doing that. I kind of think of it as a best of. So you'll see us do drastically more online content than print. But we enjoy having the magazine. And it's what keeps us a magazine, right? A magazine that goes digital only often becomes just a blog, which may or may not be a bad thing. But certainly I enjoy being a real magazine and being able to hand out the magazine, even though that's the printed version. The colored dots on a sheet of paper are not the main thing anymore these days. And we're doing it because I love doing it. It's kind of a really cool thing. We do a lot of software development, huge projects that go on forever. The magazine comes out every so often, goes relatively fast. You have a finished product in hands. Everybody loves it. It's just a fun thing to do for me. But yeah, it's not a money-making endeavor at this point. I don't think any of the magazines really are. But not having that business model of needing to make money is what allows us to keep doing it. And we actually have kind of a push for it, because I feel right now is a time when there's a lot of need for explanations, right? There's a lot of new stuff going on, and whenever that happens, we have a huge knowledge gap where, what you need to know is up here, what you do know is down here. As products mature, that gap shrinks, but right now there's a huge gap. And so for us right now, in a way, it's actually kind of a good time. But yeah, most people read it digitally, no question.
Awesome. All right, if there's no more questions, all right, thank you guys for coming, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you very much.